Is the Iran nuclear deal on the verge of collapse? And can crisis talks in Vienna salvage it? Tehran says it's serious about reaching a deal, but will the U.S. ever agree to lift sanctions first? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the attempt to revive the JCPOA. Well, it was at the Palais Coburg Hotel in Vienna where the Iran nuclear deal was signed back in 2015. Now, almost 7 years later, officials are back in the Austrian capital trying to revive it. Diplomats from Iran, Russia, China, Britain, France, and Germany are hard at work, and after the first day of talks, there's been some cautious optimism.
I feel extremely positive about what I have seen today in the Joint Commission. There is clearly a will to engage. There is clearly a will on all the delegations to listen to the Iranian positions brought by the new team, and there is clearly a will of the Iranian delegation to engage in serious work and bring JCPOA back to life. So I feel positive that we can be doing important things for the next weeks to come.
Now, their meeting is the first in 5 months and the first since conservative cleric Ebrahim Raisi won the Iranian election in June. But a lot has changed since the JCPOA was signed in 2015. For one, Iran has a new negotiating team led by Ali Bagheri Khani. He once called the deal a total loss for his country. But now he's at the table in Vienna insisting the U.S. lift all sanctions.
We had a constructive meeting with the JCPOA parties today, and the main item on the agenda was the US lifting its illegal sanctions against Iran. I believe that the atmosphere of the meeting could exert a positive impact on the success of the negotiations.
Well, Iran was left furious in 2018 when Donald Trump pulled out of the deal and reimposed sanctions, and Tehran responded by breaking some of the agreement's conditions. In October, Iran announced it had amassed more than 120 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium, a major breach of the JCPOA. It's unlikely Washington will lift all sanctions, but it has said it will lift those it sees as inconsistent with the accord if Iran reverses the breaches it's made. There is, though, one nation who's hoping these talks will fail completely. Israel's Foreign Minister Yair Lapid is in Europe this week, meeting the leaders of the UK and France to build his case against the Iran nuclear deal. This is what Lapid had to say from London on Monday.
The Iranians are coming to these talks for only one reason: to get sanctions lifted. They need money for Hezbollah, for their Revolutionary Guards, for their global terrorist network, and for the continued race towards a nuclear weapon. They will play for time, earn billions from the removal of sanctions, continue to deceive the world, and covertly advance their nuclear program. This is what they have done in the past, and this is what they will do this time as well.
And it appears Lapid, at the very least, has some backing from the UK. Prime Minister Boris Johnson reiterated his support for Israel and called on Iran to change its behavior.
And it is for the sake of peace that the UK supports Israel's right to defend itself with no equivocation, including from hostile states like Iran. And along with our European and American friends, we will continue to do everything we can to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And as talks resume in Vienna, we hope that diplomacy can work. But while the nuclear issue is the most urgent, Iran's overall behavior has to change. The attacks at sea, the support for terrorism, the destabilization of the region, all form part of the same pattern.
Well, it's hard to determine if we're moving closer to or further away from a reinstatement of the JCPOA, given what's come out of the talks so far. So here to tell us where they think the process is going and whether the deal can be salvaged is Borzou Daragahi, an international correspondent from The Independent and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Mohammad Marandi is a political analyst and professor at Tehran University. He's currently in Vienna with the Iranian negotiating team. From London, we have Paul Ingram, an expert on nuclear disarmament and director of emergent change. And from Washington, D.C. is law professor Dave Jonas. He served as the Pentagon's nuclear non-proliferation planner under the Bush administration. Thanks all so much for being with us. So we're hearing some optimism out of Vienna, but then we have this Israeli offensive underway that might also be gaining momentum, at least in the UK. And the fact that we still have the US and Iran not able to engage directly in these talks. Borzou, is it realistic to believe that this deal can be brought back to life under these conditions?
I think that there is a possibility. The thing that is important to remember is that there are many, many paths to no deal. The US and Iran can just stick to their talking points, stick to their maximalist positions, and it's very easy for the whole thing to come apart. And if no one compromises and no one comes up with some creative solutions. But if there is goodwill, if there is some creativity, there is a narrow chance for this to succeed. But it means that each side has to relent on its tough positions. Each side needs to expend some domestic political capital, and each side has to be willing to trust the other side to a certain extent.
Trust in short supply. But Mohammad Marandi, you are in Vienna. How are you feeling so far?
Well, I would disagree with your studio guest. I think he's being very conservative and cautious. There's no moral equivalence. One side left the table, tore up the deal, and forced other countries, including the European Union, to violate the deal, and all of their obligations were violated for years. And the Iranians remained in the deal. They remained in full compliance.
Okay, but how are the talks going now? Do you feel good about any progress or lack of progress?
Well, the point is that the Iranian talking points are based upon the framework of the JCPOA. So the issue is not compromise. The issue is whether the United States is willing to come back to the table. The Iranians are still in the deal. Even when the Iranians ended their compliance to their commitments, it was within the framework of the deal in accordance with Articles 26 and 36. When the other side refrains from abiding by its commitments, that gives Iran the right to discontinue implementation. So even when Iran decreased its commitments or halted its commitments, it was doing so in accordance with the deal. So the point is the United States willing to reverse course and to implement the deal? If there is a will in Washington, then of course the deal will revive. But there's no way that Iran will accept any blame, because the Iranians were the ones who stayed at the table.
Okay, Dave Jonas, you're in Washington. Do you think there is a will?
Well, I think that Iran has a will for one thing only, and that's to proceed with its acquisition of nuclear weapons, which has been their goal for years. They have consistently violated international law in regard to UN Security Council resolutions. They violated the legally binding safeguards agreement that they had to enter into under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And of course, they've continued to violate this deal. They say they're in the deal, but yet they've enriched to 60% now uranium instead of the 3.67% that they were allowed under the deal. So the only possible way that we could ever get back to a real deal, to re-entering the deal, is to have the Iranians get back into compliance with the deal. Now, I don't know how they undo their enrichment to 60% purity, and when they were supposed to limit it to 3.67%.
Okay, Paul Ingram, I know you disagree. I know you feel Iran has, it's met its obligations under the deal. But I have to ask you this: the United States has acknowledged that time is not on its side. So if Iran continues then to go forward in violation of the agreement that we acknowledge the United States disengaged from unilaterally, if Iran continues to go forward enriching and stockpiling uranium, spinning centrifuges, and more than anything, acquiring knowledge, when do we reach the point of no return? What cards will Iran have left to play? And when do these negotiations render useless, effectively?
Well, we're not at that point yet. You've just heard a very strong case made by Mohammed that demonstrates that Iran feels a moral high ground here and strong talking points. Now these play not just in Iran, but actually across the region. And I think it's very important for the Americans and the Europeans to recognize that the world is shifting and moving, and we need to work out together how we want to contain and control the worst excesses of behaviors. Now, Iran's behavior has not been the worst and most excessive, but it could become so, and it's moving down a track that is very, very dangerous. But it's dangerous not just for Iran, it's dangerous for the West, and it's dangerous for Israel. Because if we go, do we want a world where everybody's engaged in confrontation and developing these technologies that are highly dangerous in anybody's hands? Or do we actually reach out and try to understand that the Iranian story narrative on this is very challenging, but actually has quite a lot of merit? And we need to be actually reaching out and developing, building on that relationship, and that's what these talks should be focused on. Yes, the technical detail, but we have to also ask the question: what sort of a relationship are we looking for with the Iranians? Are we going to continually demonize them, or are we going to draw them into a more constructive relationship? And I see no evidence from the previous administration that Dave represents, and I see very little evidence from the Biden administration that they have been treating that seriously either, because they seem to be under the influence of the Israelis far too strongly.
Borzou, I saw you cringe ever so slightly.
This is exactly what I was talking about. If you're going to if this is not diplomacy, this is like laying out these positions that we hear from Washington and Tehran, or from Dr. Marandi in Vienna. These are exactly what I was talking about. If you want to stick to your little island and make your case like that, that's fine, but you're not going to have a deal. It's just not going to happen. You cannot take the context. The Americans cannot pretend like the last 4 years didn't happen, that Trump didn't torpedo the deal, that its client Israel did not target Iran repeatedly. And Iran can't pretend that it is like this, innocent lamb in the woods that's being attacked. Iran is not very popular in the region, as we can see in Turkey. Iran does clandestine operations here that have angered the Turkish government. It has supported armed groups that rankle other minorities and majorities in other parts of the Middle East. So it's not like this innocent, normal country. Iran is a disruptive player among other disruptive players, and it can't pretend that none of that other stuff doesn't exist.
Mohammad Marandi, quite simply, we are where we are. It's kind of irrelevant now how we got here, even though I know Iran likes to drive home those talking points. So tell us, if you can, how equipped now is the new government in Tehran to compromise? How hardline is hardline?
Well, again, I have to respond to the anti-Iranian points that your guest in the studio made. His long-running hostility towards Iran is known well by myself. I know it quite well. Obviously, when he speaks about unhappiness in the region towards Iran, he's talking about Saudi Arabia, he's talking about regimes that are highly despotic. And I understand his position. He works for Western media, and he has to work within a particular context. But I think if he focuses on the issue at hand, then I can talk about the issue at hand. Otherwise, Iran's position in the region in fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and what role the United States and its allies played in creating and strengthening ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and his silence in that regard, is something that we can leave for another day. But Iran is more than willing to compromise, but not on principle, not on the JCPOA. The JCPOA was Iran's compromise. The JCPOA was the agreement where the Iranians compromised, and they compromised a great deal. In fact, many people in Iran believe that the previous administration gave far too much, And there's a lot of merit in that argument. I was never a supporter of the deal, nor an opponent of the deal. I think there are flaws in it, and I think there are strong elements in it. But this administration right now is saying that the deal, which was the compromise, has to be abided by. All sides have to accept it. We cannot keep, the West cannot keep moving the goalposts. They cannot say, okay, the JCPOA is our compromise, and then when Iran fulfills its obligations within the framework of the JCPOA, they say, no, we have a JCPOA plus. And then when Iran accepts that, then it's a JCPOA, another JCPOA, a JCPOA. That's appeasement, and it's a never-ending, dangerous path for Iran to follow.
Borzou, I'll let you respond very quickly, and then I want to get to Paul. Go ahead.
I mean, I'm just laying out the arguments as I hear them, and I think it's not just despotic regimes in the region. It's that's disturbed somewhat by Turkey's behavior. It's by Iranian behavior. It's Turkey. It's movements, grassroots political movements in places like Iraq and Lebanon and so on. That are disturbed and upset by Iranian actions. As to who I'm working for,
I regularly travel to Iraq and Lebanon.
Sure. Okay, no problem. But as to who I work for, I'm very transparent about who I work for.
Yeah, so, and I'm very transparent about my feelings on what you say.
Fair enough. Paul Ingram, when you hear Iran say it is willing to compromise, but then lay down some pretty inflexible conditions, if I can phrase it like that, where do you think it leaves the real scope for negotiation?
So I wanted to pick up on Mohammed's point about compromise, because the Iranians definitely do need to compromise on their demand that the US administration tie the hands of any future administration. It's just not possible. But what we do need to do as Europeans, as Americans, and those negotiating with Iran, is to give them some comfort that we're not going to just walk away at the smallest opportunity. As has happened. There is a point that needs to be addressed, but the Iranians will absolutely need to have to compromise in order to move to an agreement that is in Iran's interest, an agreement that is in the interest of the rest of the world.
Okay. Dave Jonas, if I can come back to you, because, you know, for many it is still so hard just to reconcile how the Obama administration worked so hard to secure and, you know, celebrated the Iran nuclear deal, only to have the Biden administration, Obama's own vice president, have this difficult a time reinstating it. We've heard mention of Israel so far, and the fact that the U.S. might just be at the mercy of Israel. Is that what's going on here?
No, not at all. I think everybody is a big boy. The United States is a big boy, and Israel is a big boy. We certainly consider Israel an ally and take their views into consideration. I think the Trump administration took their views into consideration far more decisively than the Biden administration. The Biden administration, as far as I can tell, along with a lot of the Democratic caucus, is anti-Israel in many respects, whereas the Trump administration was very strongly pro-Israel, as evidenced by the Abraham Accords, which were a very important peace deal in the region and sort of changed the balance of power in the region significantly. What I'm concerned about is the Iranian desire to have the Biden administration be able to bind future American administrations to this. As a legal matter, if the Obama administration had wanted to do that, then they needed to take the agreement through the Senate as a legally binding treaty, and have it let the Senate give advice and consent, and then let the president ratify it. In a legally binding deal like that, while a future administration indeed can pull out, as we saw from the ABM treaty, the Open Skies treaty, also legally binding, which the U.S. did pull out of, they pulled out many, many years later. The only reason the Trump administration was able to pull out of this so quickly was because it was a non-legally binding agreement that was not even signed. It was a simple handshake. So when people make a big deal out of pulling out of this agreement, when it was nothing more than a political policy position, ultimately, I don't think you can give too much credence to that.
Well, it was enshrined in the UN Security Council. That's something.
That does count.
I mean, I would just say that it is, you know, it was enshrined by the UN Security Council resolution. It was voted on by the UN General Assembly. I mean, that's something. It's nothing to ignore. You know, I mean, unless the U.S. is just totally, completely focused on being a unilateral diplomatic force, it does count for something.
Right. I want to move on then to one final issue that's really in its midst right now, because Israel's Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, as we mentioned, has been visiting both Boris Johnson and now Emmanuel Macron to convince them to form a united front against Iran. Mohammad Marandi, I know you have expressed many times before that Iran couldn't care less what Israel says or thinks or does, but do you worry at all about this offensive it's trying to build with European leadership?
No, because Iran does not put any faith in anything that the Europeans do. When the Americans dictate to the Europeans how to behave, that's what the Europeans do. So I think Europe has diminished in the eyes of Iranians over the past few years, because it's become clear that they have no real sovereignty. Their decisions are largely made in Washington. Iran has seen that very clearly. But what I would like to add, though, in response to what Paul said, and that is that, and I'm speaking here as an Iranian citizen. I'm in Vienna, but this is as an Iranian citizen. Let's say hypothetically that the U.S. administration fulfills its obligations, but it cannot assure that that the next administration is willing to continue. Well, the Iranians, if they want to respond to that, they could demand compensation for the lives lost and the destruction caused to the Iranian economy for the U.S. violation of the deal and the violation of the deal by the Europeans. So if that's the case, then the issue of compensation and the issue of carrying out the agreement, all of these are up for grabs. So unless the United States finds a way forward, the Iranians cannot go and dismantle parts of their nuclear program, and then 6 months down the road, you have someone tear up the deal again. That's just simply not going to work. The other side has, if they want Iran to go back to 2015, and if they want Iran to go back to 2015, then they have to go back to 2015. And if they are concerned about Iran's nuclear progress, the damage that they've done to the Iranian economy is much greater than that. So no matter how you look at it, Iran is the victim here. Iran signed the agreement because of the false accusations made by the United States that it was pursuing a nuclear weapon. Iran adhered to the nuclear deal from beginning to end. And yet now, Western countries are demanding Iran compromise. Well, final point, the world is changing, as Paul said earlier. China and Russia on the rise. Iran has survived, more than survived, the maximum pressure campaign. If the United States wants to continue with conflict with Iran at a time when its rivals are on the rise, there's no doubt that the United States will be the big loser in all this.
Okay. I mean, Borzou, if the U.S. doesn't bend, and it doesn't seem it will, because the conditions Iran is putting forth were as logical as Dr. Marandi once says they are, the United States is not going to agree to guarantee no further sanctions in the future. How can this really work?
I mean, they can't guarantee no future sanctions in the future, no sanctions in the future, but they can build up some trust. Look, I understand where Iran is coming from, and I'm on record in my articles and pieces sort of putting the onus on the Biden administration, pointing out their failure in not getting to the talks earlier in the beginning of this year when they first took office and so on. But at this point, as Dr. Marandi and everyone else says, the world in 2021, and we're on the verge of 2022, is not 2015 anymore. It's a darker, tougher, more dangerous planet right now. We're just coming out of this terrible pandemic. Does Iran, does the US really want this issue on its plate at this point? Should not cooler heads prevail? Are there no adults in the diplomatic community that can work out a way to de-escalate the situation at a time when there are so many other bigger, pressing planetary problems?
Dave Jonas, your final thoughts?
My final thoughts, I would just like to say that I would not bet that this administration, the Biden administration, does not so badly want back into the deal. In other words, the Obama administration wanted this deal very badly. And in my opinion, they got a bad deal. The Biden administration, which is largely peopled by former Obama administration officials, very much wants this deal back. And so what they will be willing, I'm frightened, quite frankly, by what they will be willing to give in order to get back into the deal. We shall see.
Okay. Dave Jonas, you will have the last word. We will have to leave it there. I'd like to thank all four of my panelists really so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.